So good evening. I hate to interrupt all of the discussions and the conversations and the catching up and the fellowship, but you know, I'm just going to be a little selfish. I get to teach, so y'all need to listen. Glad y'all are here. I just have to say it. Yes, I'm wearing a Louisiana Tech shirt. It's the start of football season, college football season this weekend, and I'm just giving a little bit of shout out to my Louisiana Tech Bulldogs. They'll be playing the Mississippi State Bulldogs, so it'll be a dog fight. Ha 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 ha. Did you say something, Rhonda? Did you say something ugly? Okay. Well, all right. I'm just going to leave it there. Do what now? Well, actually, Tech missed it. Now, my brother was in the midst of New Orleans, and he's one of these that says, I am not leaving. And I said, Robert, come this way. I'm not leaving. And so he called me yesterday from a friend of his in Leesville, Louisiana. And he goes, I know what you're going to say. I finally had to leave. I couldn't take the dark. I couldn't take the heat. I couldn't take the whole bit. And I said, well, why didn't you come to Houston? He said, because Leesville was closer and I didn't want to drive too far. So I said, all right. But I said, it got a little rough for you, didn't it? But he's one of these that says, I always ride out the hurricanes. So, all right, go ahead. But you were welcome here. Anyway, we're gonna go back a little bit. We were working our way through Psalms, but we're going to go back to Psalm 6. And the reason being is that it's what's called a penitent psalm. There's 7 penitent psalms in the corpus of the Psalms, on all of the different versions, or all of the Psalms that are in there. There's 7 of them that are considered penitent psalms. They are psalms that where the writers are being disciplined, or they're experiencing suffering or discipline because of something they've done, and they're crying out to God. Now, the other penitent psalms are Psalm 32, 38, 51, 102, 130, and 143, and we might go through a couple of those so you get a flavor of them. But these psalms are really helpful to us when we need to confess sin. And you go, I never have to confess sin. That's what Mary Frances is back there. She goes, me? I never have to do anything like that. But if you're human, there's a time when you find yourself outside of the will of God for whatever reason, just because you're being stubborn, rebellious. Life seems to have gone against you. There's difficulties that seem to be you're facing, and even in those moments, and I say you don't necessarily have to have done something wrong, but all of a sudden your attitude changes, or you get upset, or you get despondent, or you begin to wonder, God, where are you? I'd put forth to you that if God's word says, I will never leave you nor forsake you, then what happens when we start questioning, where are you, God? We're questioning His faithfulness, and you may not think of that as sinful, but those things lead us into a sinful attitude, or a negative attitude, where I think God calls us to be trusting and to be understanding that He's always going to be with us no matter what the difficulties are. And this last bout of COVID, this last upswing, I've just seen a lot of people just almost get despondent over, okay, here we go again. Now we got to go through this again. What are we going to do? And I thought, okay, let's just go through a penitent psalm. David is writing this psalm. The heading at the top of Psalm 6 says, a prayer for mercy in time of trouble. Now, we're not really sure when David wrote this psalm. It could have been when he was at the end of his reign and he was beginning to be less visible, and his son Absalom decides he's going to usurp the throne. You can go to 2 Samuel chapter 15 and you can begin to read about that. But But his son Absalom begins to be more visible. He stands in the gate and he begins to judge the people, and he begins to act kingly. And then eventually, while David is still alive, he tries to take the throne, and David has to flee. And then because of that insurrection. And so maybe he's writing this psalm because of that. Now, David would sit there and say, I haven't done anything wrong, but my enemies are assailing me. God, where are you? Why have you forsaken me? Or it could be that it was in the middle of his reign. David had a time where he was ill and he was being attacked by enemies. And he describes his plight in verse 5, he describes his plight as fears within and fears without. And he cries out to God for mercy. God, why have you forgotten me? I don't know if any of y'all have ever been in that circumstance or that situation, but in verse 5, we know that he's facing death, so this is not an analogy. He's not simply using sickness or war as a metaphor. We know that something is happening and something's going on against him. And so he pens this psalm. Now, you know the psalms were intended to be sung, right? So, now, if we're going to be in here, I'm going to teach you, so I want you to learn these things. And so it says, for the choir director with stringed instruments. And then it says, upon an 8-string lyre. And so people that know these things would tell you that David wrote this to be sung by a male choir. And there's just something about male voices. And he indicates in the Hebrew a letter, which would indicate perhaps a tune that they already knew that they would have put this to. But David, after he went through this and he gets through this difficult time, pens this psalm to kind of show how he feels. Now, in this, there's basically 4 sections to this. The first, verses 1 through 3, you see the pain that he's in. And he's going through some sort of discipline or chastisement that the Lord is putting him under, but it's causing him pain, and you'll see that, and you can probably identify with it. In verse 4 and 5, he begins to negotiate with God. He begins to try to talk his way out of it, so to speak. You know, God, I mean, if I'm dead, how can I praise you? Type of stuff. Have you ever negotiated with God when you're in the midst of a difficult time? God, if you get me out of this, I will. I mean, if you ever had a test in school, I know that's the old joke. There's always going to be prayer in schools as long as there's tests. But God, if you just let me pass this test, I promise I'll go back to church. I mean, you know, there's any number of things that I can remember my life doing that when I was younger. In verses 6 through 7, you just see despair. He moves from the pain to trying to negotiate to finally despair, as he's basically, I call it brokenness. He just becomes broken before the Lord. And then in the last few verses 8 through 10, you see something changes. And when he's broken before the Lord, all of a sudden the joy of the deliverance of God is evident in his life. And he pens that in those last few verses. And so this is a psalm that when you're going through a difficult time, you know, maybe you can go and read it and identify with David as he goes through this difficult time. And so let me read the first 3 verses, and then we're going to start going through it bit by bit. But he starts out, he says, "O Lord, do not rebuke me in your anger, nor chasten me in your wrath. Be gracious to me, O Lord, for I'm wasting away. Heal me, O Lord, for my bones are dismayed, and my soul is greatly dismayed. But you, O Lord, how long?" I mean, when you begin to read this, and you realize it's Hebrew poetry, but you begin to look at the imagery that he's putting out there. He goes, God, don't keep chastening me. Don't keep rebuking me. 8 times in the psalm, David addresses God as Lord Jehovah in the covenant name. And when God deals with his children, he usually rebukes, then chastens, just as parents do. Now, before we get too far in there and you think, okay, why is God doing this to David, or why is he being rebuked or being disciplined? It's different than being punished. Okay, there's a difference between being punished and being disciplined. In Hebrews 12, verses 5 through 6, it says, "And have you forgotten the exhortation which is addressed to you as sons? My son, do not regard lightly the discipline of the Lord, nor faint when you are reproved by him. For those whom the Lord loves, he disciplines, and he scourges every son whom he receives." And you think, man, that sounds so harsh, doesn't it? But God is not disciplining David or chastising him to hurt or harm him or to be vindictive to him. It is to bring him back to the place he needs to be. I mean, when you chastised or rebuked or disciplined your children, hopefully it was to correct wrong behavior, right? And sometimes you couldn't be very gentle with that. I know that I did not spare the rod because I love my children. In Proverbs 3, 11 and 12, it says, "My son, do not reject the discipline of the Lord or loathe his reproof. For whom the Lord loves, he reproves, even as a father corrects the son in whom he delights." And so this was not a punishment put out by God who's irate at David, but if it's a chastisement or a punishment or a discipline, it is to correct a behavior or to bring him back. So sometimes God deals with us because of our disobedience, right? Other times he chastens us to prepare us for what lies ahead. The fact that David thought God was necessarily angry at him because David's in the midst of something. Either it's Absalom's rebellion or it's enemies have come against him. Something is happening to David that has made him think that he's done something wrong, or that the Lord has forgotten him, or that the Lord is not listening to him. And so just the fact that David thinking God was angry with him doesn't necessarily mean that it's true. Now, surrounded by foes, there's evildoers, there's enemies. His body was weak. But maybe God was letting him go through this to teach him something. Maybe God was, and the reproving is that David had forgotten that God had always been with him. Why are you now questioning the fact that God is with you? So let's put this into today's circumstance. Anybody in here at some point during the last year and a half or however long COVID's been going on feel a little bit of despair and wonder, God, why are we going through this? Why are friends dying? Why are people getting sick? Why is this happening? And in that questioning, we began to wonder, God, where are you? And perhaps that's what David is doing. But 3 times he uses this Hebrew word bahal, which means he's faint, he's weak, he's troubled. He goes, listen, I'm fading away in verse 2. My bones are dismayed. I am in great distress. My soul is greatly distressed. David is painting a picture of just being in a state of mind that is just almost hopeless. He's just wondering, God, where are you? And then in that last line of verse 3, he says, but Lord, how long? How long do I have to go through this? How long until you answer me? How long until this is over with? And sometimes we ask that a lot. But God sends him through this, perhaps to learn a lesson, to equip him for the work that he wants him to do. But really, ultimately, what God is looking for is submission. And David is not submitted right here. He's almost defiant. Throughout the Psalms and even in Matthew, there's a couple times that you hear that phrase, how long, God, will you allow this to happen? How long will this go on? Can you empathize with where David is right now? Maybe not COVID, but maybe some other circumstance in your life, maybe something else that's happened. So David is really expressing the pain of being chastised by God or being disciplined by Him or being brought into a place where he can submit to God, where he can recognize that God's grace is sufficient, that I don't have to have everything that I want. I have to be submitted to you and do what you want, Lord. That's a hard place for a lot of us, especially in this country, in this world, in this place where we've been raised. Why can't we have it all? This is the land of the free and the home of the brave. We're supposed to be able to pursue happiness, and everything's supposed to be great. And the fact of the matter is that that's not always true. I would garner a guess that in this church of several hundred, that there's probably 10% of people that are just going through things that you'll never know, but their heart is broken over whatever they're experiencing at that time. And I would say everybody in the church has gone through some heartache, something that has hurt them or caused them to question or to stumble. And David's not stumbling from his faith. He was a man after God's own heart, but he's hurting. I mean, he's just hurting, and he's gotten to that point. God, where are you? Why aren't you listening to me? Why is this happening to me? And then in verse 4 and 5, he begins to negotiate. He goes, "Return, O Lord, and rescue my soul. Save me because of your loving kindness, for there's no remembrance of you in death. In Sheol, who will give you thanks?" David says, listen, God, come back to me. God's never left you. We may have turned our back on him, but he's never left you. The illustration that I've used before is this. I got it. We're recording, so I need to stay here. So, if you're walking with the Lord and you're keeping your eyes on him, it doesn't matter what's going on around you. He's going to be right there with you. But sometimes we end up turning around and turning our back on God. He hadn't left us. We just can't see him. And we think we've been forsaken. And so here he goes, God, please, just rescue me. The heartfelt cry is palpable. I mean, it is visceral. It is real. It is raw. It is all of the emotions that you can think of when you're in the midst of that depth or that difficult time. God, please rescue me. And then he says, okay, don't save me because of me. Save me because of your loving kindness. Remember, God, you're the loving, kind God. You're the one that save me because of that. Don't save me for me, but save me because of your reputation. He's starting to negotiate. You see it? God, just listen, in verse 5, nobody remembers you in Hades. Nobody remembers you in death. Now, this word for Sheol or death can mean the grave, or it can mean the afterlife, or hell. And he's basically going, how can I, and by the way, the Hebrews at this time in King David's time didn't have a full understanding of the life after death that we have, that Christ brought us in the New Testament. But here he's sitting there going, listen, God, if they kill me, if I die, who's going to remember you? I can't do it from the grave. Therefore, you have to save me, God, because I'm telling people about you. You got to save me. And then he goes, who's gonna give you thanks and praise you in Sheol? God, that's my job. You got to get me out of this, God, because you're so righteous. You got to do it. And oh, by the way, I mean, if I'm dead, I can't tell people about you. I can't talk about your greatness or your goodness or your mercy and all of those things. And if I'm in Sheol, well, I'm just going to be quiet. Have you ever negotiated with God? Even in the midst of the deepest, darkest time, you probably have said something along these lines. God, if you just help me. God, you're merciful. Show me mercy. God, I need your grace. David is still crying out to God. He's still in the midst of whatever's going on, but he's starting to crack a little bit. Now that cry for him to rescue my soul is still there. By the way, there's other places that people have done this, and in the other penitent psalms you see some of these things, but remember King Hezekiah? He used a similar approach when he prayed for deliverance from death. In Isaiah 38, 18 and 19, it says, "For Sheol cannot thank you. Death cannot praise you. Those who go down to the pit cannot hope for your faithfulness. It is the living who give thanks to you, as do I today." A father tells his son about your faithfulness. Remember, he was facing death. He turns over to the wall. He starts saying these things. God, please, hey, if I die, I can't praise you. And God gave him 12 more years, and he just messed it up. Be careful what you ask for. I mean, you really need to be careful. He gets on to verses 6 through 7. And he starts out, I'm weary. I'm weary with my sighing. I'm tired of this, God. I can't go on anymore. By the way, I want to point something out, because the next line says, "Every night I make my bed swim." In Psalm 3, we have a morning psalm. In Psalm 4, we have an evening psalm. So in Psalm 3, verse 5, it says, I lay down and slept. I awoke, for the Lord sustains me. In Psalm 4, verse 8, in peace I will both lie down and sleep, for you alone, O Lord, make me dwell in safety. We're back into the evening. And then in Psalm 5, verse 3, we're back in the morning. In the morning, O Lord, you will hear my voice. In the morning I will order my prayer for you and eagerly watch. And now here in Psalm 6, we're back in the night. Just a little gee whiz thing. But there was some order to these things. And probably whoever put these together probably was laughing a little bit. Night, day, night, day. But he sits there and he says, listen, I'm weary with sighing, and every night I make my bed swim. What does that say to you when he says that? Pardon? He's sad. He's weary with sighing, and every night I make my bed swim. He's crying. He can't sleep. He gets in bed. He tosses. He turns. He can't find rest. He's weary. He is just at his wit's end. I mean, I can just see him getting into bed and flipping and flopping and turning, and and finally his wife turns over. Well, he had a whole bunch of wives. But anyway, one of his wives turned to him and said, "Get out and go someplace else. I can't sleep with you flipping and flopping." I hope she'd have been more compassionate than that. But if you've ever worried about something that you had to do the next day, and all you did was toss and turn, he's in a much worse state. I love the imagery. Every night I make my bed swim. Every night it's just up and down. He was not sleeping, and that lack of sleep was being replaced by suffering. He goes, I dissolve my couch with my tears. It's just, it's heart-wrenching listening to this. If you read through it quick, you go, okay, yeah. But you really begin to think of what he's going through. And by the way, we're talking life and death. If it was Absalom would have eventually killed him. He had to run for his life. If it was his enemies, they were not going to let him live. They would have killed him. They would have taken the throne away from him. Whatever he was facing at the time, it was probably something that included death. And not only his death, but his family members, because if a new king took over, that what you wanted to do was you wanted to eliminate anybody that had a claim to the throne. Anybody. And that was the way they did it back then. So David not only had the weight of what was going on his own shoulders, but the care and concern for his family and for his kingdom and all of the things that were happening there. And, you know, this idea that I soaked my bed, I mean, it was all I could do. And so he goes through and he talks about that. And you know, sleep is important for healing. Have you ever gone without sleep or been sleep deprived? Did you make good decisions? One of the things they did to us when we were going through survival school in the Air Force as air crew is they tried to keep us up. And they played this weird music. They had these sounds, people screaming, babies crying. I mean, it was all this kind of stuff to try to keep you awake because they were really trying to get you to be sleep deprived. And I'm going to tell you, it works. You say some really dumb things when you have gone 36 or 48 hours without sleep, and it's tough. I mean, it mentally is tough. And if you're not sleeping because of a concern or because of something that's going on, your decisions are not going to be very good. He goes, "My eye has wasted away with grief. It has become old because of all of my adversaries." He was weakened because of this lack of sleep. And he says that there was a dullness in his eyes. They become wasted away. What's one of the things the doctor does when you go for a physical or you go and you see him? Well, yeah. And I got to talk to my doctor about that. He doesn't give me enough time to get the keys and the wallet out of my pocket and he doesn't even let me take my shoes off. But yeah, they look in your eye. Do you know it's amazing? You think they're just looking in there to see if it reacts, but there's a lot that doctors can tell by simply looking in the eye to see where you are physically. And you know, David is describing that. He goes, "My eyes they're wasted away with grief. They're dull." A guy once said, "I hear Christians say that their pain and sickness brought them closer to God, but," he goes, "in my case, it didn't always happen." And the commentary I was looking at said, he commented on this. He said, "Listen, this was good to him because from his own experience in pastoral ministry, he's learned that sickness and pain either make us better or bitter, and the difference is faith." David's faith is wavering right here. I mean, he's just on the edge. But he's beginning to let himself go. He's beginning to yield. We have to turn to God and pray and trust Him. And David is going to get to that point here in the next few verses. Lord doesn't always give us what we ask for, but He does give us what we need. And we have to remember, even in the deepest, darkest moments of our life, that we have to continue to trust Him. Now I'm going to go off on a little bit of a tangent, but you know, the 23rd Psalm, when it says, "Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for your rod and your staff, they comfort me." That idea of walking through that valley of shadow of death was thieves and robbers and people that wanted to hurt you would hide in the shadows as you walk through the valley. And the shepherd had to trust that God was going to be with him through that difficult journey, because they would go from pasture on the hilltop to pasture on the hilltop, and sometimes they had to go through the valleys, and that's where the danger was. And so, as the psalmist writes, you know, "Your rod and your staff comfort me, God," even in those difficult times, in those dangerous places. And so David is having to remember that even in this difficult place, God has not deserted him. And even though you hear the real pain and you hear the cry that's being let out, you have to remember that you can't let your faith waver, no matter the circumstances or the difficulty that you face. I don't know if y'all were here for the funeral today, but I'm talking to the Watkins family, and I realized that they'd lost a son. And that pain, I can't imagine that pain. I've tried to come to grips with that. What if that happened to me, if I lost one of my sons? And I would like to say that my faith would remain strong and stay firm. But I'm sure in the midst of that, it would be a difficult journey. And I might empathize with David here a lot more than I can right now, because I haven't faced that much. Some people have faced things that are beyond my comprehension. And so I don't want to be flip about this, but whatever difficulty you're facing, whatever you're going through, you have to remember the faithfulness of God and the promises of God. And what will get you through that difficult time is holding on to your faith, that God has not forgotten you. Even if it is a traumatic loss or a tragic loss or something that just really shakes you to the core, you have to hold on to your faith. And so something happens here as David is writing, and at this point in verse 8, there's this sudden change in the tone and tenor of the psalm. It goes from suffering to joy, and it's the same experience that's recorded in several other psalms. In 22:22, he says, "I will tell of your name to my brethren. In the midst of the assembly, I will praise you." Now, just before that, he says, "I'm weary of my sighing. Every night I make my bed swim. I'm dissolving my couch with tears. My eye is wasted away with grief. How it has become old because of my adversaries." And then all of a sudden he says, "Depart from me, all you who do iniquity, for the Lord has heard the voice of my weeping." All of a sudden, joy begins to creep in. "The Lord has heard my supplication. The Lord receives my prayer. All my enemies will be ashamed and greatly dismayed, and they shall turn back, and they will suddenly be ashamed." You see this in several other psalms, like I said. And it doesn't matter why the change occurred, but he begins to write out that God has answered his prayer. He's beginning to heal his heart. He's realizing that God is bringing him out of whatever difficulties he's in, whatever discipline he's experiencing. God is taking him out of that. And perhaps, word came that his enemies had retreated. Better yet, that they had been defeated. We know that eventually Absalom is taken off the throne, and David recaptures the throne. And even in that, there's despair because of the loss of his son. But whatever the news was, David saw the hand of God begin to move. And he says, "The Lord heard my weeping and answered my request. He's accepted my prayer." And so he uses this experience to begin to glorify the Lord. So he goes to this joy. "Depart from me, all you who do iniquity." You got nothing for me. You're trying to take me down. God's heard my prayer. You need to leave. All of a sudden, he steps up and he says, "Listen, God is with me. Who can be against me?" I mean, he understands. God has heard his prayer. He says, "The Lord heard the voice of my weeping. He has heard my supplication. He has received my prayer." And then he uses it to praise God. He begins to talk about how this message comes to him. But he says, "All my enemies will be ashamed and greatly dismayed." So he goes, "Listen, you guys that were against me, you thought I was dead. You thought I was out. You thought I was done. The joke's on you. You're going to be shamed because my God has listened to me. He has heard my prayer. He is taking care of me." He says, "You'll be ashamed and greatly dismayed, and you'll turn back and you'll flee." This is where he goes through those stages. He's in great pain. He begins to negotiate. He gets to that point of just utter despair where he's just broken. You see, he's going through these stages. First, it's almost defiance. Why have you left me, God? Then it's, well, God, if you don't take care of me, I can't praise you. Then it's, I'm just undone. I'm just broken before you, God. And that's when the victory comes. That's when he says, listen, my enemies, they're fleeing. God, you've heard my prayer. You've listened to me. It's so much, I can relate to this so much in different things that have gone on in my life that it's kind of scary when you get to that point of realizing, God, I just need to be broken before you. And I think that's what, as we grow more in our faith, that we get to that point of being broken earlier and quicker. Does that make sense? As we live through some things and we see the faithfulness of God and we know that He hears our prayers, that we get to that point of putting aside our own selfishness or our own anger at whatever circumstance we're in, and we begin to realize that God is hearing us once we become broken before Him and say, God, you hadn't left me. You hadn't forsaken me. So, with this psalm, I thought it would be something that would be good for today, just with people going through some different things. Have you experienced, if you think about it, have you experienced going through this? Now this would have taken maybe weeks or days for David to go through this, but he was going through something significant. Can you empathize with what he went through and the steps that he went through? Anybody want to share those or share one? And you don't have to.
I can just simply say 10 years of taking care of my husband.
Yeah.
And passing.
Yeah.
God never left us.
Yeah.
It wasn't a test of our faith. We wanted to use it as a testimony.
But by the time you got to that point, you had been tested and you had learned and you had realized that you didn't need to let go of that faith. I dare say that there's some of us in here that may be tested severely one day. And you have to remember that God is always faithful. And with any difficult circumstance, there's stages of grief, stages of that. There's anger and then denial and all of those kinds of things. And you have to go through those things. But you always have to come back to faith. You always have to come back. God is listening to you. He may not give you the answer you want, but He's certainly giving you the answer that's best for you. And David figured that out. And then he came back. David was a man after God's own heart, and we need to be following God and doing the same things, trusting Him and holding on to Him. Any questions? Was this helpful? Because I'll go to a really happy psalm next if you want me to. Where he's praising God for all the good things that go on. We can have a health and wealth psalm fest. God's way, not the TV preacher's way. Yes, ma'am.
I think that was really good, and what speaks to me, as someone told me one day, our circumstances in life are your pulpit, ultimately formed by God. And in the midst of suffering, I forget that, and people say that people are watching you, and it's not what you say, it's what you do. Wow, she's going through a hard time, but she has a smile on her face. And then you reflect Christ through our actions.
That's a real good sermon. I don't, if y'all couldn't hear, and basically she said that it's how you act as you go through a difficult circumstance that becomes a testimony. Is that a fair statement? And that what she got out of this was that you always hold on to God. And that begins to be a testimony. You know, people look at you and go, you're going through this difficult time, but how are you still smiling? Or how are you still having hope? And you have that opportunity to tell them, because I know the one who gives me hope, which is Christ. Now, I editorialized that. I added, she didn't put that, but that was sort of what she was saying. Sort of? Okay, good. I'm just making sure. I'm a preacher. I add to things. I try not to embellish things, but I try to add to things. Any other comments?
Well, I think she's so right in that what she brought up there, because I had breast cancer. In the last 22 years I worked in the lab, I worked in the same place. And I was not like, oh God, why me? Because a lot of people get breast cancer, and I'm like, oh, well, why not me? But the thing was, how did I have it? You know, 2 people came up to me years later that worked with me and said, I got breast cancer. You came through it. How did you do it? You're fine. I mean, you're mentally, and I was had a great chance to witness.
Yeah.
You know, so I'm not going, oh.
You know, but sometimes you can't control.
No.
I mean, sometimes,
Yeah.
I'm saying that that's good, you know, I agree, but I'm just saying, sometimes it's just like more than you can take at the time, and you can't just go, I mean, it's hard, there's certain things that happen in your life that you give them to God, but you're gonna come back to it.
Yeah. Well, and I see that in this too. I mean, David got to that point of despair. It was just almost too much for him. But then he realized that God heard his, so to me, it gives me hope that because I get into that place of despair, I'm not out of God's grace. It's just I have to be broken before him to get there. And, and
But like you said, there was a lot of time between that and then
yeah,
it just don't,
it doesn't just happen overnight.
next week, you know.
Yeah. I think he spent a few sleepless nights and tore up a few couches. Yes, sir.
Christ got to that time. Christ went through grief in the garden and on the cross. The cross is meant to bring you to your knees.
Yeah.
And, we can look at the things in our life and you were in the military. If you're getting closer to the target, you get more and more flak. And that means if you don't have flak in your life, maybe you're solid deep enough in the ground.
I flew in an unarmed airplane. We didn't want any flak next to us, and especially because it was a refueler. It was, if it blew up, we said it was a crowd pleaser. But you're right. I don't know that he got to the point of despair, but he certainly was under great distress, which David was under great distress to the point of sweating blood, which we know is a real physical condition that people under stress, the capillaries in their sweat glands will burst, and when they sweat, it will be tinged with blood. And so we know that he was under great stress and duress. His humanity was there, but he said, "Not my will, your will be done." And he got to that, he just got to that point of, I trusted you before, I'll continue to trust you now. And yeah, so the cross does bring us to that point of brokenness, of seeing our need. And along the lines of your story, a dear friend of mine who passed away in my first few years at Everman, he was diagnosed with cancer, and he went through the little bit of anger, went through the negotiating with God. Came to me and said, "Jim, I'm a good person. Why is God doing this to me? I still have a family." Now, he was in his 70s, and then he went through just a little bit of despair for about a week. And then after that, it was done. He realized God's taking care of me. And he would come back, and it was melanoma or skin cancer on his head and on his neck. And not to be too graphic, but he'd come back after radiation, and the skin would be cracked. And, it just looked like it hurt. And he'd go, "Jim, I got to witness to the guy next to me. I got to tell him about Jesus, And he goes, "I know why I'm going through this." He goes, "I'd never been in those couches getting chemo if I hadn't had this. I would never have gotten to talk to the x-ray techs if I didn't have this. And he did eventually pass away. But, it was the most peaceful room I've ever been in, or one of the most peaceful rooms when he passed away. But, it's just, he'd figured it out. But he went through all of those things to get to that point of, okay, God, you got this. And, he may have had some despair, but his faith was still strong. And then it was even stronger after that to be able to continue to witness and to tell others. Roy Bean was his name. He would come and he'd put his arm around me. He'd go, let's walk around the church and let's go dream what God's going to go do here. I love that man. And anyway, neither here nor there. Any other questions or comments? Listen, you may be sitting here and you may be going through something. And maybe you can empathize with some of these feelings. Just hold on. God is going to never leave you. He will never forsake you. He will always get you through these things. Even when you think you're not. Even when you think you can't handle it anymore. God is going to get you through it. And maybe it's not anybody in here. Maybe it's somebody that's going to listen online that needs to hear this. But I pulled this up today because I just couldn't. I was going to go to Psalm 32, and it just wasn't working for me. So anyway, thank y'all for coming. Let me go ahead and pray for us. You'll get out of here 15 minutes early. Do not get used to it. Father, I thank you for this word. And not only is it something that we can, probably all of us, identify with, Lord, help it to be something that encourages us to not lose our faith, to hold on to you, to know, Lord, that you can get us through anything, and that, Lord, nothing is too difficult if we keep our eyes upon you. And I pray, Lord, that even for those that may be at that point of despair, as Ann said, I mean, sometimes you can't help it. Sometimes it's just so overwhelming that you just can't think straight, and you can't understand how things are going to finally open up and things would change, and then they do. And then we see that your hand was on us throughout the whole storm, not just coming out the other side, but Lord, you've held on to us and watched over us and cared for us and loved us even through the deepest, darkest moments. And Lord, I thank you for that. And I pray that in that our faith would always grow, and that our witness would be to glorify your name and to tell others about you, and that, Lord, you would be glorified through our lives. No matter what we're going through, Lord, I pray that we would honor you and glorify your name. In Christ's name I pray.